Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Anne and Kief. Welcome to the show, and looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure. I look forward to visiting with you and having a great conversation.
Yeah. So, Anne, like me, the trauma really came to the fore later in life, I think. Anne talked to me before we started recording today. She was saying how it wasn't until her early 50s that and she's now in her 70s that this feeling of being rejected really came. You became aware of that. How would you describe that awareness?
Well, I was doing an introspective study, and it was like an aha moment that it was like, oh, so that's why I've behaved certain ways over the years. And then I could go back and tie in those ways, kind of label those ways, all the way till before I was born, because my mother knew she wasn't going to keep me. And I think that you carry a child differently then. So I was basically, in my mind, when I started putting these together, I was rejected before I was born. Even my parents, they treated me the same with my brother, who was their natural born, 5 years older. But in my mind, I kept comparing myself to my brother, and I couldn't meet up to it. Our interests were very different. Now I know in families where they're not adoptees, the interests of siblings could be very different. But in my mind, when I realized all this, I saw it as the way I reacted oftentimes through my childhood was feeling I was somewhat rejected because I was different from my brother. My interests were very different. And so tying it together, I didn't let it label me or define my identity, but it definitely had an effect growing up. My adoptive father was a general and very disciplined, and I always felt like I had to be the perfect daughter, which again I think was somewhat motivated that I didn't want him to be mad at me. I mean, and again, I think even in normal situations, a lot of children will have the perfectionist attitude, etc. But I think it was magnified as I go back and look at it. I was bullied a little bit on a school bus. I was the patrol in front of the bus, and somebody yelled up, and this was in high school, somebody yelled to the front, "Hey, Ann, is it true you're adopted?" And everybody started laughing. And so that was a rejection. When I was dating my husband, my mother said, "Have you told him you're adopted?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course." And it wasn't intentional, but in those days, adoption wasn't looked at like it is now. It wasn't as common. Well, you didn't hear about it as much. It may have been as common, you just didn't hear about it as much. And so it's almost like, not like I was a freak, but like I was set apart, like I was just different. And my mother, we had a mutual friend who was a neighbor of my parents. She was 20 years younger than my mother and 20 years older than I. And as I was an adult, I got to know this woman, and she told me once that my mother had commented that she was surprised that I reacted and acted like any biological child. So it was almost like my mother even expected it to be different, between when I was born, when they agreed to adopt me, it was before I was born. And they said that they would adopt me if I was a girl, not if I was a boy, because they didn't want to compare a boy to my brother. And then even before I was born, they changed their mind and they said either way. And thankfully I was a girl, so that helped some of that process. But there's a lot involved with the parents thinking through this too, because they wanted everything to be normal, but it was still always kind of in their mind too. And I didn't want to do anything to hurt their feelings, so I didn't even try to find family until after my parents had passed. I had a great childhood. This wasn't about not having a good childhood. It was about filling in the blanks and finding the rest of my story. It wasn't about this family or that family. In my mind, it was all one big family, even though it wasn't. I'd love to know what my parents think of this journey that I've been on. But they're all family. When people talk about a family tree, it's like, okay, which family tree do we want to talk about? You know, my grandmother on my adoptive side was very much into genealogy. She'd say, your great grandfather was so and so, and I'd say, no, not really, you know, because it wasn't my blood relative, you know, and I couldn't verbalize that. But in my mind, as I looked back and processed the whole rejection things, I could see that that was still always in there. And I think that's a very common feeling with adoptees. I think it can be a feeling with non-adoptees also, but I think it's particularly common because they kind of want to know the rest of the story, you know, and what might have been life like in this other scenario. I mean, I was German and born after the war in Germany, lived in Germany half of my childhood, very different culturally. And having connected, I wonder, what would my life be like? My mother never married, you know, things like that. You know, you never really get all the answers, but it's a process.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there. There's so many similarities between you and me, and so many differences as well. You know, I guess the first thing that struck me is that the plan was made before you were born, and that seemed, that for you, that seemed to be part of the rejection. For me, it wasn't, right? So when I got my adoption file 8 years ago and found out that the plan had been made before I was born, I thought, well, they didn't. She didn't give. This is really, it sounds really weird, but she didn't give. She didn't give birth to me, look at me, and then say, no, I can't parent this child. It was like, well, it wasn't the rejection of faulty goods. And I've got a silly metaphor, but it relates to Germany, right? And I said that the German stuff might happen, so I spent a bit of time in Germany. I worked in a coffee factory in Berlin, and one of the things that I did was I stood by this machine, which wrapped cardboard around the packets of coffee, right? So it's a flat carton, and it's wrapped around. Now, as the silver foil wrapped packets of coffee come down the conveyor belt to go into this machine, right? That the vacuum is tested by the machine, and if the machine detects that the vacuum has gone, the seal has gone, they know this coffee is not going to keep, and it's not. And a little lever came out and kicked this packet of coffee out of the way, right? Now, that's when I found out that the adoption plan was made before I was born. It meant to me that I wasn't rejected like one of those vacuum packs of coffee. So we had two different. The hearing about the adoption plan being pre-birth had completely different impact on me than it did on you.
And I think when we unfold our stories, we're putting our interpretations into them, which may or may not be the reality. Like my mother, I know she dated my father. I don't know how long, but the way I found that out is her lifelong friend had written in her diary that she was shocked to see my mother out with an much older man, said he was also of nobility, shook his hands, he had white hair, and she kept that image in her mind, my mother's friend. Well, my mother never admitted to being pregnant, even to her best friend. So I've often thought about the kinds of thoughts that she had over the years. And we have reason to believe she was possibly pregnant another time too, but never found any proof with that. But and she never even talked to her best friend about being pregnant. She said she'd eaten too many chocolates, she was going skiing, And the friend had written about it in her diary and said, and I bet she comes back much thinner, and
Yeah.
so
That's the shame thing. I mean,
yeah,
we're
absolutely.
talking mid 40s, late 40s.
Yeah.
Um, and,
But
and shame was a bigger vibe.
oh
I suppose
yeah.
a bigger
And
thing.
I wondered, would she have kept me? You know, but I've learned through this process that at that time you had to be 21 to make the decision to keep the child. And she was 18. My father was 45. And so my grandfather had to be the one to make the decision. And mainly because of the age differences, he decided no. So she knew she wasn't going to keep me. And the lady who arranged my adoption was living with my birth mother and grandfather when I was born, took my mother to the hospital and was there when I was given to my adoptive parents, said that she didn't want my mother to hold me. But apparently my mother did hold me. But she still knew she was going to give me away. So I can't help but often think about her. When I first learned that they'd found her, I thought she was alive. Turned out she had passed years prior, but the adoption office thought she was alive, needed to contact her. So I wrote this heartfelt letter telling her a little bit about me and thanking her for not aborting me and seeing that I had a good home and telling about her grandchildren, etc. And then 3 days later, I found out she wasn't alive. But I shared that with the cousins that I met so they would get an idea of the sincerity. But there's a lot of emotions to process, whether your mother knew that she was going to keep you or not. You know, a lot of mothers know that they're not going to keep the child, but the child doesn't necessarily ever find that out either.
Yeah. The key word that you said for me at the top of that answer was the word interpretation. So around 40, I interpreted my I interpreted this teddy bear that I was given by my birth mother as a consolation prize. I won't swear, but there was some other there was some adjectives, expletives before and then later on, 8 years later, it became clear to me from the information in the adoption file that it wasn't. It was it by no means was it a consolation prize. It was a symbol of her love for me, and in that moment I realized how wrong my interpretation of the events were.
She was like giving a piece of herself in the best way she could.
Yeah, giving a piece of herself, and so this whole idea of how we interpret stuff as human beings, as adoptees, is kind of like a fascination for me. So have there been any, have you before we started recording, you talked about a friend of yours who was adopted having a 180-degree shift. So at one point she didn't want to know anything about her birth family, and then somebody contacted her and she had a 180-degree shift. Have there been any what shifts in your the way you see things, the way you interpret stuff, have there been over the last 20 or so years?
Well, not as dramatic as it was for my cousin, because I felt like my cousin was just bearing the idea. She had a good childhood, and she said, I don't want to know any of the other, I've had this good childhood. And her parents had already passed. And then when somebody reached out to her, it was like an aha moment. It was a trigger kind of thing that she was excited that, okay, I can connect with somebody that I'm related to. Yeah. So it wasn't as that dramatic. However, I think, and it wasn't like a one moment thing, other than the fact of the emotion of knowing that they had connected with my mother, thinking she was alive still at that time, was huge. I mean, all weekend I was I was a wreck, waiting to find out if I could talk to her. And then it was a huge letdown to find out, no, she wasn't alive. And then it was like, then a cousin through this process emailed me, and all of a sudden I had a picture of my mother. And it's like, wow, there's somebody in the world that I resemble other than my children. That was huge to me. That was just, it was a connection, whether I ever met her or not. It was like somebody looks like me. And every time I would connect with anybody, I would first look to see, do I look like that person? And if anybody complimented saying my children look a lot like me, it's always meant a lot. I think I've also, and I can't prove that this was because of being adopted, but I personally think that I have had a hyper focus on unity of family. And that's been a struggle because, in this era of dividing people, it's a struggle sometimes in any relationship, but I've seen it a lot in families. When you have a difference of opinion, whether it's politics or other things, but particularly in this day and age of politics, people tend to want to reject the person and stop liking the person. And to me, I want family to be all, let's all get together at Christmas, and oh, I miss you, I love you. And I raised my children to be independent, but they didn't have to move across the world to do it. They're in California and Australia, and I'm in Florida. And so we don't get those family moments that were always in my dreams. I always dreamt that grandchildren would be nearby. I didn't want it to be like with my parents. My children couldn't be near their grandparents very often. And my parents being in Germany for 11 years, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have social connections, etc. I can't even imagine. All this process has made me have the perspective more of my parents. Maybe that part of it's just being older. But a friend of mine the other day who's having challenges with her children aren't even adopted. And she said, I wish now that I had spent more time with my parents. So we tend to think, and part of it's age, but part of it is as I've unfolded my story, I want to share it with my parents who are past. I want them to like what I have found out. I think my father might like it, but he rejected, as I was telling you earlier, he rejected me more in age as his brain changed. My mother, I think she would be very open to hearing the story, but I keep trying to put myself in the perspective of what did my, parents think, my birth parents and my adoptive parents. My aunt, my adoptive aunt, basically kind of wrote me out of her will, basically, when I unfolded my adoption story. She knew I was adopted all along, but she never could understand my wanting to find my family, because she always kept saying, but you had a great family. Yep, yes, absolutely. But I could never get her to understand the feeling of wanting to know more, to put the pieces together, know the rest of the story. And so she basically rejected me with that. I still kept going back to visit her because I'm the only one of the nieces and nephews that did, but she was my mother's sister, and I wanted that family unity. And so I was the only one in the family that really went and showed her love. And that's because I just wanted that family unity. And everyone else in her family had turned against her. She was a very, very difficult woman. Stubborn enough, she lived 102. So, but I think processing all these emotions is a continual process. You never get an aha moment and say, oh, now I got it all figured out. It's all good.
Yeah. How has your relationship with rejection changed over the last 20 years?
Being aware of why I feel the way I feel has helped me to cope with it better. It's made me less fearful of processing the thoughts. I don't tend to bury them like I used to, like I don't want to deal with that. I tend to want to bring it in the open and shine some light on it, so that I can deal with it better. and realize, oh, I'm feeling this because I'm feeling rejected. It's not, that person didn't necessarily reject me. It was more reflection of that person's personality or that person's behavior, that it wasn't necessarily rejection of me as a person. I tend to have an enabler personality. I want everybody to always feel happy, and I tend to try to adapt to everybody else. Again, in my case, I think it was related to being adopted, because I just wanted to fit in with everybody. I want to make everybody happy. And I probably denied part of my own growth and fulfillment in life, because I did so much based on what I thought that person wanted me to do.
Yeah.
And I have wondered from time to time over the years whether, if I had realized those feelings earlier, if my career would have taken a difference. I was very active in my career, very successful. But then when children were born, I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, and I did that for many, many, many years till circumstances forced me to go back into the work world. But it changed me because of this fixation on want to be the perfect family with the white picket fence and the dog and the station wagon and the whole bit. So I was driven a lot by what others thought of me. Still am, but I now being aware of that and I'm less afraid of their rejection, because I just am more aware of the process and more open to getting my thoughts out.
Yeah. Have there been any particular moments, I think you called them aha moments, for your cousin? Have there been any aha moments along that journey, that change relationship with rejection?
Yeah, there have been. I'm trying to recall. Well, one of them, like I was sharing with you earlier, when I connected with the family in Germany, and they were very open. I mean, my son and daughter and my husband and I all stayed at my one cousin's house. They're very open to accepting me. And everything was wonderful. And I just thought, oh, this is going to be great. We'll be in touch. And even though there's a distance, there's FaceTime and things like that. And I've learned that the German culture, generally, they're not as open to that type of communication and sharing feelings and emotions. And so when I came back to the States after a couple of the different trips, and I would be reaching out to my cousin, and I could see from the text response that she saw the text, but didn't respond. So again, I was going through the rejections, like, oh, I was just this fun new toy, and the thrill's over, back to reality kind of stuff. But it was an aha moment for me to realize, okay, here's another test, and to know that, no, that was her personality. I've learned over the years she doesn't communicate much. She doesn't return the texts. When I would be over on the next trip 3 years later, she would apologize for the last 3 years of not responding, because she knew she wasn't doing that. But every single time I go through that process of opening up to figuring it out, it's an aha moment, because it refreshes my soul, and it gives me light. It doesn't hold me down like it does until I figure it out. So I do have those repeatedly. I'm one that wants to, I forgot the exact word that somebody once said, but look for the most generous response of a person. In other words, look for the best. Look for the other person's perspective. What's the best that you can give of their perspective? Are they busy? It's just not their personality? Versus, oh, I don't want to be in touch with you, I'm rejecting you, whatever. Look for the best response. And then it makes it easier for you to begin with, because more often than not, I think the best response is the true response, because I don't think people intentionally want to hurt other people, especially when you've already said, no, I accept you, kind of thing. I'm not going to turn around and intentionally try to hurt you. So look for the best response of another person. And I think that just makes it easier. I always want to have hope. That's another aspect of this rejection issue, kind of a yin and a yang kind of thing. Hope is, I think, the thing that kept driving me to discover my story, because there's 13 years up and down, with gaps in there. But every time there'd be some kind of a little trigger to get me going again, there was that hope. There was also the reality that there could be the rejection again. And I had to get stronger, have perseverance to continue. It would have been easier just to say, nah, this is my life, deal with it. Might have been easier for me to just keep looking, especially when I started dealing with another country and another culture.
Have you read any adoption books?
I've really focused more on listening to people's stories than I have reading adoption books.
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to speak at a number of organizations, and people will come up and share their stories. And I'm constantly amazed at what aspects of my story will touch different people, whether they've been adopted or not. And so when we share our process, whether it is through another book, I haven't read a lot on adoption books, because everybody's story is different, and I think I'm more of a person that goes for, kind of like you, personal development. So I have read a lot of books on how to make me better, how for me to deal with life. Reading somebody's adoption story, there might be a little nugget here and there, but once I completed my book, I've got my story. I'm wanting to know, how can I be better at dealing with rejection? And I don't know that reading someone else's story is going to help me with that. I do a lot of personal development books. I read a lot of Christian books. So I just want to be a better person. And whichever family or combination of families, I want to touch them as they have touched me. So I want to be an impact for them too.
The reason I ask is I haven't read many adoption books either, and one I did read was this Primal Wound book, and I didn't really feel primarily wounded until I read the book.
Oh, that's not the reaction you probably wanted, huh?
No, and I was talking to somebody about this a couple of, probably 18 months or so ago, and it was as if, like, there's a couple of different terms for it. So a kind of more. Have you heard this phrase in personal development? What the thinker thinks, the prover proves.
No, haven't heard that one.
It's a description of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah,
and it's a.
And the book is kind of that way, huh?
So, well, and the psychologists have a word for it, and it's called confirmation bias. They call it confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in a good way, you talked about looking for the best in people, right? So mm-hmm. that's so if you look for the best in the people, then you will find more. Mm-hmm. You find more good in people, right? So confirmation bias cuts both ways, mm-hmm. right? It can cut positively, or it can cut negatively. But for me, what I've thought, when I've been thinking about rejection, I had this. I wrote I wrote something down in my little notebook. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, not adoption podcasts, honestly. Mm-hmm. Just they don't really give me the insights that I'm looking for to fuel my development. But I put in one of my books the other day that I put down just a single phrase, and it was the projection of rejection. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have felt, I think that I project it, mm-hmm. and the more I do it, the more I do it. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean?
No, I can relate. Yeah,
you can become kind of like it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy, and yeah, and you said you can agree with that. How do you see that playing out for you?
Yeah, I that's why I like the awareness of my rejection issues, because kind of like when you're talking about that book, when I realized that I had rejection issues, at first it was almost like an excuse for my behavior, or a badge of honor, so to speak. Things would happen as oh yeah, there we go, I'm rejected again. And then you get rejected again and again and again. And it's a downward spiral. And that's why I continually, it's never, I've arrived. It's a continual process to take that. When I realize there's a rejection issue, I can go either way. I can let it spiral down. I can be the martyr complex, and it's like, oh, that's my cross to bear, so to speak. Or I can try to turn it around, either the other person's perspective. I have what I write, the very, very, very last thing I write in my book is a phrase that I also write in the cover when I autograph my book. It says, notice your blessings. And what I tell people when I explain why I write that, I said, I write that because I feel like if you think about this, it's kind of profound. So you really like to think it through. I have a phrase I say, the more you notice your blessings, the more you notice your blessings. You have to think about it,
Yeah.
If you're seeing a blessing, you're tuning your brain to seeing blessings. And then you will be more prone to see blessings. And even as I was writing my book, I would see some little thing, and then it's like, oh wow, that tied in with this, and I mean, the lady who was a lifelong friend of my birth mother died a couple of weeks ago at 94. And I realized, wow, that's the same day as the birthday of my birth father. So you just start noticing these little things. And a lot of times that took me off into further tangents of discovery. So that's one of my favorite terms, is notice your blessings. Because the more you notice your blessings, the more you'll notice your blessings.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know whether this was a podcast I did yesterday or a conversation I had yesterday. It is that our culture in the West, and I'd say it's probably in Germany, the UK, and the US, right, mm-hmm. is exactly opposite that. Mm-hmm. The culture is what's wrong, So I don't know. I don't know whether you're aware of England's relationship with Germany and football and soccer. I'm talking about and penalties, right? Yeah. Penalties. Yeah. So we're recording this a week coming up a week after England got knocked out of the World Cup, and it wasn't by the Germans this time, and it was we went out because somebody missed a penalty. Yeah. And the headline in the Sunday Times, which is hopefully one of the higher quality papers in the UK, so it's not a tabloid. It said, "It's all over for England again."
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So our media focuses us. Well, yeah, if it's got a negative inbuilt negativity bias, and so I live in Yorkshire, some Yorkshire people can be a little bit negative, shall we say? So I met a guy walking the dog a couple of months ago, and I said, great day, isn't it? And he said, for how long?
Yeah.
So society wide, we are not noticing our blessings at all.
It doesn't get the clickbait.
Yeah.
It doesn't get the clickbait. They got to give the negative headline so you can click on it and read the article.
Yeah.
And how often do you find positive articles?
No.
Unless you look for them. And that's why I say the more you see the blessings, the more you see blessings, because you're looking for them, you're being more aware of them. And that's why most of the books, I very rarely will read novels and things like that. I'm almost always either a Christian book or a self-help book, just because I want to be better at it. But it reminds me, because we forget. It's nice to sit here and say, we're going to spend the rest of the day just looking the positive of everything. We're going to look for the good and everything. And we wake up tomorrow and we forgot that we're going to do that. We need constant reminders, because it steals our joy if we're just focusing on the doom and the gloom and, oh, here it goes again kind of thing. If I kept saying rejection, oh, there I go, being rejected again. And I might do that from time to time. I might have my own little pity party. It's not like I've overcome this by any means, but I feel like every time I do overcome it, it takes me a step closer to making it easier the next time.
Yeah. Can I recommend a book to you?
Sure, I'm gonna write down.
It's called You Are the Happiness You Seek.
I like the title.
It's by a guy called Rupert Spira. And are you into audios or
I tend to read more. I download to my iPad a lot and read from there.
He's a British guy with a really lovely, crisp accent. He's not too posh. Sometimes English, I don't. It grates me somehow. But and I love his delivery. I'm an audio guy rather.
So he has that as an audiobook?
He has that as an audiobook.
Well, we RV a lot and travel a lot, so it might be a fun thing to listen to.
Yeah. So if you want the audio, go to the. It's not on Audible. It isn't his audiobook. Presumably because they Amazon, that own Audible, take so much money that the author ends up with nothing.
Amazon's not very friendly to personal authors. They make more money than we do off of their sales.
Ridiculous. Yeah. Well, what was his divorce settlement? Was it 20 billion or something? I can't remember. Jeff Bezos. So if you want the audio book, I'll put the links in the show notes, because I know that people are driving. So if you want the audiobook, you need to buy that off Rupert Spira, rupertspira.com.
How do you spell his last name?
Spira, Spira. And the reason that the reason I mentioned him, and I do name check him quite a lot. I've got a healthy addiction to Rupert Spira at the moment. He is absolute genius.
Awesome.
Absolute genius. And the reason I mentioned him, because you talked about stealing our joy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The premise of you are the happiness you seek. Mm-hmm. It is the idea that we are innately happy, mm-hmm. and that happiness is veiled.
Mm-hmm. Well, babies are basically born happy unless they're wet and hungry.
Yeah,
we lose that. In our culture, our world kind of dampens it.
Yeah, I would say so. We learn from the world around us, like the Yorkshire farmer that says, "How long is it going to be a nice day for?" Mm-hmm. Like the media that is at the moment trying to terrify us. They've terrified us a long time with COVID. Now they're trying to terrorize us and terrify us about cost of living, inflation.
Lots of fear. Lots of fear. Well, look at how many advertisements are based on fear. Now you need title insurance because somebody could steal your title. Most insurance is based on fear. A lot of advertising is. And yeah, it's ingrained in our society for sure.
Yeah. So I think for me, we learn this stuff, and therefore we need to unlearn what we've learned. We need to look at how we've interpreted stuff, and look at our interpretations, and move back from that. And one of the key things that I'm learning from this Rupert Spira guy is what you were talking about was in terms of what you're talking about is separating ourselves from our emotions. So I think in the Western world, and also I'm talking about me, right? So I used to worry about worrying. So the idea is, you watch The Secret movie 15 years ago, or you hear this phrase from Roosevelt, was it? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Yeah.
Right. So then we're wrong because we're feeling the wrong emotions. I'm wrong because I'm worrying about worrying. And by worrying about worrying, I'm going to that's actually going to cause a negative outcome.
Yeah, mentally and physically.
Well, so then we become emotophobic. So then we're obsessed. And I mean, I again really here. Then I'm obsessed by emotion. So what am I going to do about this feeling? What am I going to do about this feeling of rejection? I'm projecting rejection left, right, and center. What am I going to do about that? How can I feel? And we kind of like follow the train of thought. We follow the train of feelings. Whereas I had something beautiful yesterday. And it was our being is underneath our feelings. So it's focusing on the background rather than the foreground. The foreground is all the drama. The drama on the screen hides the screen of awareness that we are. I mean, this Rupert Spira guy. Sorry.
And I think you have to be intentional to try to overcome some of that. As an example, I'm active in the Chamber of Commerce, and so there's like business after hours or group things, or it could be somebody going to a party. And we've all had those experiences where we go to something and we don't know anybody. And sometimes I'm just grateful to have my husband there because that's somebody I know. But even we can experience this even as a couple that I often do singly. If I'm standing there to myself, sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't know anybody here and this is really awkward. I'm standing by myself, so I need to leave. Rather than being intentional and going up to some complete stranger, which isn't easy, but I do mentor people through the chamber, and I again, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, I tell people when you're networking or you're trying to meet people, look at that person who's standing by themselves. Instead of going up to a group of people, go up to that person that's standing by themselves, because they're just dying for somebody to come up and say hi. And look at how much joy you're going to give that person, and imagine how you'd be feeling if you were that person standing by yourself. Because if you're that person standing by yourself, your tendency is to go find a group of people, where sometimes you just need to be intentional to find that other person standing by themselves. So I think to overcome some of these fears, we literally have to be intentional and have to think, again, someone else's perspective for us to get a better grasp on how we can make someone else happier, which is in turn going to make us happy too.
Yeah. So I like you, my story, my reunion, my search story was on and off. And at one phase it was off. I decided I'd got her name and I'd found out my original name as well, which I didn't know I didn't even know I'd had one. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a bit of a surprise. And yeah, I thought I had an issue. So I was like, okay, well, I need to explore this. I was intentional. Okay, I'm going to get some therapy. I spoke to a few therapists. Most of them were really nuts. And I just thought, you know, they couldn't express, by nuts, I meant that they couldn't, they couldn't even explain their process to me. They couldn't, they couldn't share any stories about who they'd worked with, because it was confidential. I said, I don't want names. I just want to know how, you know, I'm trying to, I'm like, if you're having so I'm sitting in an extension here, right, that was built, and we didn't take up any references. But if you're going to take up, you know, and it was a complete nightmare. So if I ever build another, have an extension built or have a house built, I'm going to take up references. I'm going to explore with the builder and do it. I'm going to do due diligence, right?
Sure.
I was just doing due diligence with these therapists, as I was concerned, and they actually, one of them kind of gaslighted me. So it was my problem. You know, what right did I have to ask them questions? So they were nuts. They're nuts, right? The ones I met. Maybe it's different in the States. Maybe they're better. Maybe I don't. Who knows? So I picked the best of the bad bunch, really. But yeah, one day I had a complete meltdown in the therapist's chair when the idea of my birth mother rejecting me again came to my head. And I went to fear, and then I went to anger, and then I went to, I'm not going to let this fear stop me. Or hang over me. I'm not going to have this fear hanging over me, or the what if question. And then I restarted my search. And this was years ago, 8 years ago, who knows, 7 years ago, 6 years ago. And somebody said to me the other day, well, I thought that was, I didn't think that that's what the therapist wanted. She said, no, you're supposed to have meltdowns in therapist chairs. That's the name of the game. And I was like, my interpretation was off.
Yeah.
The interpretation was off. I thought that she was supposed to calm me down, not heat me up.
Yeah. She had to pull that plug out.
Yeah.
Stopping everything in there.
Yeah. It was as if, you know, she ripped me apart, and that led me to, you know, the finding the file. And I wouldn't have done that if that hadn't been the case. I wouldn't have had that step on the healing journey. There's been lots of other steps on the healing journey, but that one was perhaps one of the most profound, and it's definitely one of the easiest ones to explain to other people, because it's this teddy bear and it's an emotion on, you know, it's very concrete. It's very, the letter from her is very expressive. It's not just a light bulb going on in my head that I can explain to others. It's a very visceral, tangible story with lots of props, and that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a blessing to have that. It's kind of like building a house. I mean, if you have a house and you want to remodel it, you got to kind of tear it up to make it more beautiful.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that in the therapy process with her.
Yeah, and it's like that. I'm going back. I'm thinking about your dad and being a general, and I'm thinking of watching the Richard Gere film, An Officer and a Gentleman, and but pretty much every military story that's about boot camp, about basic training or whatever they call it, they take these young kids in, they break them apart, and then they rebuild them, and they rebuild them to go through to go through walls, and not do a lot of thinking for themselves sometimes, but they've got to follow the chain of command. And as you're saying, like your dad was a general, I'm thinking, that like he was a general. I would guess he was a general first, and a father second.
Yeah, it was a very disciplined behavior. He was involved with the Nuremberg trials for 11 years after World War II. So he saw a lot of really rough stuff,
11 years. 11 years talking about that stuff. That's
why I lived
really screw him up.
Yeah, that's why I lived in Germany the first 9.5 years of my life, because they adopted me a little over a year after they were there. So he had, post World War II things. I can see it even in my brother, who's 5 years older, the effects of that kind of environment. He wasn't a general at that time. He became general during my childhood. But obviously he wanted to be a dad, because he pursued trying to find a child to adopt, even before my mother got over there. They agreed they wanted to adopt a German child, but the Germans didn't want their children adopted, so that was difficult. But so he's the one that made the first putting the information out there. There was actually another attorney that he was working with, who was dating this lady who lived with my birth mother and grandfather. Well, he wasn't dating her at the time. She worked for him as an interpreter because she could speak English. And so she worked for an attorney that worked with my adoptive father. And so my adoptive father, in talking with the attorney, was just talking about, they'd like to adopt a child. And then she happened to be working for him, and it all unfolded. But yeah, it definitely affected his life. He was a very independent person. His father died when he was 9. He was the oldest of 3. And so he kind of,
tough cookie. And for people that wondering what we're talking about, Nuremberg trials. So the Nuremberg trials were when the Brits and the Americans brought the Nazi leadership to and the military to court. And so 11 years talking about that stuff has got to leave
Plus, he was chief of prisons division. He oversaw all the prisons. And even when I was in high school, when he flew back over to Germany once and was taking a helicopter over the prisons, he could point out some of the famous names that we've heard in the news. And, so yeah, it had to have been a very tough thing. Plus just adapting to the war conditions, So that definitely affected, my childhood, the way I was raised, and, couldn't go to parties. They had to know where I was every second, because even the first 11 years of my life, they could potentially have to, or 9.5 years of my life, they could potentially have to evacuate at any moment. So my parents had to know every second where I was. So I became a little bit too much like that with my own children when they were little. I needed to know where they were at every moment, but that's what I grew up with.
So, Anna, I'm conscious of time. Is there anything, obviously you've talked about it, but as always, listeners, check out the show notes for links to the guests' websites, social medias, media and books. You'll find Anne's book on there. Find out more about her fascinating story. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, I just think the key points are to, when you know that there's something in your personality that needs to be dealt with, deal with it and work on it and make it better. Because we all have issues, whether we're adoptees or not. But the more you can not hyper fixate on things, but just try to think things through, look at other perspectives, and never give up hope, I think we make progress as a people.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing so openly, and it's been a delight. And thank you for listening. Listeners, we'll
Thank
speak
you,
to you
Simon.
soon.
Certainly enjoyed it, and you're doing a wonderful thing trying to help people. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. And you're welcome too, listeners. We will speak to you very soon. Bye-bye.
All right.